Okay, good morning all. So my name is Matthew Coller. I'm well, interesting that I've got a science background. As Fiona said, we're trying to really bring people together from both sides. So I've sort of started in the scientific side, moved through doing a whole big e-learning project at the University of Melbourne, into doing a Master of Multimedia. Then I've ended up in the Faculty of Arts at Monash University, doing now a PhD. My supervisors are Ian McNiven and Tim Denham, who are both archaeologists, and Kim Marriott, who I'm not sure if some of you might even know, is in computer science at Monash, and so working in data visualisation. It was really good to get that two sides, the IT side and the sort of art side, together. So my project is called Temporal Earth. It's really, has a somewhat ambitious aim of visualising world history across all timescales. Okay, so, and the idea basically is, can we go from atlases, which are the old way that we used to try and communicate historical knowledge, to something that's a bit more like digital Earth models? Now, what I mean by digital Earth models are the sort of thing we used every day when we use interactive maps to go exploring the whole world at different scales. So what something like Google Maps or Google Earth does is it takes all the different scales and puts them all together. So whereas in the past, with a paper map, you'd have to jump from page to different scales, this combines them all together. You jump seamlessly from one scale to another. So my PhD research is essentially to ask, can we do the same for the time dimension? Can we take the paradigms that we understand from things like Google Earth and Google Maps and apply them across to the time dimension? So, the method that I'm using is to build some experimental visualization prototypes, and ultimately, hopefully, this could move on to being an open, collaborative content repository, something like Wikipedia or OpenStreetMaps are probably two good examples. Now, it turned out this idea is not new. In fact, back in 1998, Al Gore proposed this idea of a digital Earth, which was this sort of grand plan that we would build a multi-resolution, three-dimensional representation of the planet into which we can embed vast quantities of georeferenced data. For example, we'd get all the satellite images, and instead of having them in a data silo somewhere, plastered them all over a virtual globe. And that led and inspired the development of Google Earth. But part of that same speech was that you'd also be able to go back in time through days, years, centuries, even geological epochs to learn about dinosaurs. Now, Google Earth does have some ability to go back through time. You can go back through some old, like, aerial and satellite images, go and look at Warsaw before and after the war, which is a pretty dramatic difference. And it has this language called KML, which stands for Keyhole Markup Language, but anyway. And it has the little bits I put in green are the bits that can do some sort of time. And you have, so you can do time span and time stamp, so you can make anything last for a certain length of time. And you can also do a track, which is basically like, so you can make, for example, this is an example of using the timestamps to actually do flu outbreaks. So this is an animation through time of where all the avian flu travelled around the world. And then there's GPS tracks, which were really aimed at people just cycling around and having a GPS on them. But then I thought, hang on, maybe we could make, imagine that James Cook, 250 years ago, had been carrying around a GPS. What data would we get off that? And I started combining it together with some stuff like his journal. And in the end, produced a huge amount of stuff, put it all together to create an animated history of Australia. So this is how it runs in Google Earth. So this is a data set that works in Google Earth. That KML language has been declared as an open geospatial consortium standard, which means it should have longevity and it should have interoperability between systems into the future. So this works in Google Earth, but the latest thing which I've been doing is to incorporate this stuff into using Causium instead, which is an open source virtual globe. So just like Google Earth, in Causium you can zoom in on the globe. So I'm basically using essentially the mouse wheel here to point at something and zoom in. But down the bottom here, you can see that I've got a timeline showing a sort of schematic of Australia's history. And in the same way that I interact with the globe, I also interact with the timeline. So I can drag the timeline backwards and go back through time. So let's go back and find James Cook. So here we are, 1770, that's his path there, going up the east coast of Australia. But I can also use the mouse wheel to zoom in on the timeline. So now I'm stretching it out. So now we can see James Cook's voyage actually took 3 years. And when I stretch it out further, and this is applying the cartographic principle of level of detail, which is the really key principle in spatial maps, but I'm applying it here to the timeline. So the timeline shows you more detail as you stretch it out. So if I stretch it further, we get to see the different phases of the voyage, and it actually shows you different events that happen. And also the other thing that happens is once you get into this timescale, you can also zoom in a bit and we'll see the names of places that James Cook named in his journal as he went up the coast as well. So if I zoom back out, we can start to explore through time. So let's get back out to this timescale. You can see now James Cook's voyage has turned back to like one little ship. Then there's a whole lot of other ships show us what's happening. I may even be able to run this as an animation. And so there's a couple of the other ones. I'll skip through a little bit. And when we get to 1788, you'll see the first fleet arriving and then the second fleet. Let's speed it up even a bit faster. And now you should see George Bass and Matthew Flinders circumnavigating Tasmania, and then Flinders comes back a couple of years later and circumnavigates the whole of Australia. Okay, and you can see more and more convict ships coming. If you look just right in here, you'll see the yellow area is European settlement spreading out, and you can see these explorers heading out from the edge of settlement, going out and coming back, and then settlement sort of follows in its wake in that way. Now what are we getting up to? You should see South Australia being declared, and a few more explorers. We should get up to, and I can zoom in here a bit, and we can take a bit of a closer look down here. So there's Victoria, and here's the gold rush happening all up the side. Now if I zoom right in down the bottom here, you can start to see the red lines are telegraph lines being built. So what I've done is to try and prioritise collating comprehensive data sets that really represent how space changed through time for the people that are living here. One point which is rather obvious is that this is coming from a somewhat Eurocentric point of view, so it's showing really the colonial side of things, and I'd love to do a lot more on the Indigenous side, but there's a lot of issues that have to be gone through in order to allow that to happen, to actually get permissions to use that sort of data. But I'm really hoping to do some of that in the future. So as we go through, we see the telegraph lines, first of all, starting out by joining up the mining settlements. If I zoom out a bit, around 1861, we should see a couple of explorers. This is John McDougall Stewart heading up through South Australia, heading up and getting pipped at the post just here by Burke and Wills coming through. And we had a digital humanities meeting a few months ago, and I think it was Julie Cotter, who's head of Creative Victoria, mentioned that the Atlas of Living Australia, which contains all the sort of records of animals and plants in Australia through time, she said she'd looked at Herman Beckler, who was on Burke and Wills' expedition, and she'd said it was interesting that all the locations that he'd actually found all his botanical specimens sort of followed the line of the expedition. So I went and grabbed his the data out of the Atlas of Living Australia, and I've added it on here so we can actually take a look at it ourselves. And see, is it going to get, might take a moment to load up. Ah, there we are. There he is. You can see all little plants appearing through time. And it turns out, actually, if I change from this base map to a different one, and then if I zoom in here, this is actually then when they've got to Menindee, and that's where Herman Beckler decided he was a bit sick of the whole experience and quit. So you'll notice that from here on, Burke and Wills head off, and Herman Beckler sticks around Menindee, wanders off around the place, found some other specimens, actually heads up in the end up to where the base camp is for Burke and Wills. And if you look very closely, you'll see he actually leaves and heads back with everyone before Burke and Wills, rather tragically, head back and get stuck in the desert. Anyway, so that's that. That shows you some of the things you can do with data. There are a whole bunch of different possible uses for this. One is, it will make an awesome way for students to explore history. So, for example, I can take this on. So I can take, if I can go a bit further through history, incidentally, those two, the explorers, the John McDougall Stewart and Burke and Wills, were both trying to find a route through the middle of Australia so that they could build this, which came 10 years later, which is the overland telegraph. And the reason for that was that they wanted to get news, particularly from home, as it was known there, i.e. Britain, which up till that point had to come through these, which are all the shipping routes. So these mail ships would come through. You can see these shipping routes change over time. Once they build a telegraph to South Australia, the ships start stopping at South Australia so they can telegraph all the headlines from the newspapers through to the other states. And if I go to the 1870s and I zoom in, again in time, right, it'll take a little minute to load itself, I think, but here we are. You can actually see the ships themselves leaving Britain, coming through and actually travelling one after another. So they're coming every month. The other thing you can do is turn on a set of photographs. So I might zoom out a bit and zip through to about, so all the black lines are the railways, and then in 1924 we should see, this is the first Qantas air route coming up here. And if we zoom in here, these little blue icons actually represent images. It's good. So, and you can actually go through and find different planes landing at different places at different times and so on. So these are the Qantas pilots starting off on the early mail route. Then as you go through time, you get up to, I think about here, 1939, I think we've got a flying boat. And then when we get into the war, suddenly there's all the bombings across the whole of the top of Australia during that time. So basically, just to mention, the whole thing started actually as a project in archaeology, which led to me building this, which I launched about 10 years ago now, which is basically a way to go back through Australia, both looking at the whole of Australia and how it's changed back to the time when there was a land bridge, and also correlating that with images through time of places like the Barrier Reef. So you can see the landscape change over that same type of time. And if I run through, yes, as suggested by Al Gore, there are actually some dinosaurs in there. You can go and see this, which is called Sahul time, one of the worst names ever come up with for a project because no one knows what Sahul means. Also discovered no one really knows what temporal means, as in temporal Earth. So I've now reserved the domain name, which will become the home for this whole project, and that's going to be timemachine.earth, which I'm hoping should be able to be pretty accessible to everyone. Okay, well anyway, if you want to have a bit of an explorer of this, come and see me during the day. I'll be around for the day, and we can probably show you a whole load of different things. Okay, anyway, I'll leave you with that.
there.
Oh, right, yeah, oh, sorry, yes.
Question.
We forgot about that.
Yeah. I really appreciate that comment about not being able to, wanting to add more Indigenous data in there. Could you tell us a little bit more about what the main issues are, and also how difficult is it to be able to bring data in from, say, something like Atlas of Living Australia and have it in the right format for you to be able to visualise it?
Hang on, see, this will go. Okay, so first question, the issues around Indigenous stuff. Basically, I've actually done quite a lot of data sets that I can't show you. So the issues can be that really these days everything that that involves Indigenous people, any data about Indigenous people, and I think the motto is nothing about us without us, and this goes across a lot of different areas of groups of people that may have had past experiences. So really anything that gets shown that relates to the Indigenous experience really has to go through Indigenous people, and often that's through a lot of different groups. So, I mean, some examples that I know, and you often will find, for example, I think Lyndall Ryan recently released an interactive map that shows all the massacres that have happened around Australia. That was, I think, covered in The Age and so on. You can see that map, but all it is dots on a map, and you can click on them and it tells you the date. It's very hard to then take that and show it to something else, and written on the bottom of it, it says, this data may not be used for any other purpose, and so on. And I think they have had to go through quite a long process of okaying it with the different groups that relate to each one of those data points. Also, you'll find, the big wall map of Australia with all the Aboriginal language areas on it, that actually has written on it, you may not overlay this onto GIS, partly I think because they're concerned about it being used as a basis for native title claims. So they want to say, look, this is not to be used in that way. So yeah, and so I've also done some work with the University of Melbourne, which again also has to go through those sorts of protocols. Yeah, on the second question, how hard was it to do the Atlas of Living Australia? I think Julie Cotter mentioned it to me in the afternoon, and by the end of the session, I'd taken all that data, pulled it down and converted it and managed to get it shown, which I was doing really just by text conversion and doing lots of pretty serious level grep search and replaces, really. So that's the way. I mean, ideally, though, I would love to have some way of allowing someone to pick out any given species or collector or whatever and getting a data feed, and for that to be automatically converted into like KML format. And the same thing could happen for things like museums. So I think Museums Victoria, the Melbourne Museum, has actually got an API, as I discovered yesterday, because now all their images are in there and I've got to redo my whole method of showing their images. Anyway, any other questions?
That's fantastic. Is there any way to bring in third-party data sets into this thing?
In what sort of way are you imagining?
If you wanted to publish your own data set and have it combined with that information and display with that information?
Yeah, look, I'd love to do that. I've noticed, for example, there's a project, what's it called, National Map, which I know Steve Bennett has been involved with, and I mean as well as a lot of people. So Steve Bennett's a mutual friend of Fiona and myself. Yeah, that has a great ability. It lets you pull out all the data that relates to Australia from, Geoscience Australia and so many other organisations, and it lets you upload your own data, which would be a great thing to do, especially for researchers who sometimes don't necessarily want to send their data off to somewhere. They may want to be keeping it private, at least in the interim. Although, of course, I would really recommend and love for researchers to share their data. And of course, the recommendation these days is to try and license it into the Creative Commons or somehow put it out maybe as supplementary online material, because that's enormously helpful to me. And of course, it also allows me to put it in and give you credit for including it, so you actually get sort of citations and you get your work known more widely.
Thanks for the talk, that was super cool. I really liked before when you were basically showing the track that people were taking, and at the same time you were explaining what they were doing, why they were doing it. Are you planning of really, when this will be released, are you also planning of letting people add stories if they know about it?
Add stories? Yeah, in what sort of way?
So
Yeah.
say, for example, I don't know, like, imagine I'm an expert on, exactly, like the story of the cook while he was
Yep.
traveling up to Australia. Like, would it be possible, like, for me, if I know, like, the story, to add, actually, like, write the story down, so, like, while someone is visualizing it, if
Yep.
he's interested in actually reading the story, he would have, like, the script of the story going on with that.
Yeah.
All the time.
Well, actually, look, there's a project over in, well, one thing is that KML itself has a capability in it called a tour, which allows you to have like a narrated story, and that it even controls the way that the camera moves, so it actually takes you around through time. And I'd love to have that as sort of two alternative ways of interacting with this. So one would be that you would just go exploring and finding images and photos and so on, etc. And the other one would be a much more curated way of taking you through, but that you can jump off the tour at any point and go exploring around. That'd be lovely to do. That's already a capability of Google Earth, so that's one way that it could already work, because all these data sets work in Google Earth. So that could be put together in that way, or it could be put together as, like, it would take a lot of writing of stuff into the Causium open source framework to actually make that tour capability work. Also, I'm hoping to team up with this group that's been going in America for a while called Map Story, which does exactly what you're suggesting and actually has a focus very much on getting people and the experts to tell the story and really facilitating that. So that's hopefully a way to go as well.
I think we need to move on. Can we thank Matthew again for